Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats. Be sure to check out Dragon Shield for all of the best accessories to protect your decks. TCG Player for cards at great prices while supporting local game stores. And Patreon, where you get awesome benefits for your direct support. Check us out on Twitch every Wednesday evening for great games of CEDH with special guests every week. If you sub to Twitch, you get additional perks such as access to our Discord. On the 26th of this month, we will be doing a charity stream for Black History Month. We have Alex and wonderful members of the community coming on to support the Blue Heart Foundation. Playing with Power will match contributions up to $1,000. Come out and support the cause. We will be going to SCGCon Indianapolis this coming March. We will be playing CEDH in the Command Zone and recording games while we are there. Stop by and say hello and let's all jam some games together. We will also be going to the Marchesa 2022 tournament in March. Marchesa is a 2-day Magic the Gathering tournament series featuring over $2,000 in prizes. It will have CEDH, Legacy, and Conquest tournaments. Check the links in the description below for more information. We hope to see you there. Our Mox Pearl Patreon rewards are back. Every month, we get together with our patrons and record a game to be on the channel. That's what this game is tonight. So, let's start out by showcasing our fighters this evening. First, we have Zane, piloting Yidris, Maelstrom Wielder. This deck seeks to resolve and activate Hermit Druid to mill his entire library and win the game with a graveyard combo. Zane's opening hand contains a Mox Diamond, Elvish Spirit Guide, Birds of Paradise, Vampiric Tutor, Mana Confluence, Command Tower, and his London Mulligan is a Taiga. Next, we have Noah, piloting the partner pair of Krark the Thumbless and Sakashima of 1,000 Faces. This is a storm deck that uses its commanders to copy spells, accrue large amounts of value, and then eventually win with a combo. Noah's opening hand contains a Volcanic Island, Shivan Reef, Arcane Signet, Sol Ring, Brainstorm, Unsubstantiate, and a Muddle the Mixture. After that we have Rust, piloting Norin the Wary. This deck tries to slow down the game with stacks pieces and win with a combo finish. Rust's opening hand contains a Ruby Medallion, Sting Scourger, Great Furnace, Gemstone Caverns, Mountain, Impact Tremors, and a Commander Sphere. Finally, we have Mike, piloting Winota, Joiner of Forces. This deck uses its commander to break parity with its stacks pieces, overwhelm its opponents with creatures, and attack for the win. Mike's opening hand contains a Mog Catcher, Swords to Plowshares, Marsh Flats, Mox Diamond, City of Traders, Plains, and his London Mulligan is a Rionia, Fire Dancer. Without further ado, let's kick off this beautiful barrage of bumbling baboons. Zach was able to hacky sack the longest and gets to start us off. But Rust has a pre-game action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Ruby Medallion. Zane draws a card for turn and plays a Command Tower. He casts Birds of Paradise. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding Mana Confluence. Zane passes the turn. Noah draws a card for turn and plays a Volcanic Island. He casts a Sol Ring. He follows up with an Arcane Signet. He ends his turn. Rust draws and plays a Mountain. He casts his commander, Norin the Wary. Rust passes to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. He casts Mox Diamond. Norin triggers and exiles. It enters and he discards a Plains. Mike ends his turn. At the end of Mike's turn, Norin triggers. In response, Zane casts a Vampiric Tutor. In response, Noah casts Brainstorm. He draws 3 and then puts 2 back on top. Vampiric Tutor then resolves, and Zane fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Norin then enters the battlefield, and the turn moves to Zane. Zane draws and casts Hermit Druid. Norin triggers and exiles. Hermit Druid then resolves. Zane moves to his end step, and Norin enters the battlefield. And this is the point when we're just going to let everyone assume that this is what happens at the end of every turn. The turn moves to Noah. Noah draws and plays a Shivan Reef. He casts Ruby Medallion. Norin triggers and exiles. Noah then casts his commander, Krark the Thumbless. Noah passes. Rust draws and plays a Mountain. He casts Sting Scourger. Norin triggers and exiles. Sting Scourger enters and bounces Hermit Druid back to Zane's hand. Rust moves to his end step and Norin triggers. In response, Mike casts a Braid, targeting Krark. Noah responds by casting Unsubstantiate, targeting a Braid. Krark triggers and Noah wins the flip. Before declaring targets, he makes a deal with Rust to use Sting Scourger to bounce Winota back to Mike's hand after he casts it. Rust agrees and Noah bounces Sting Scourger back to Rust's hand. Then the original copy of Unsubstantiate bounces a Braid back to Mike's hand. Norin then enters the battlefield and then turn moves to Mike. Mike draws and plays a City of Traders. He casts Mog Catcher. Norin triggers and exiles. Mog Catcher resolves and Mike gives the turn to Zane. Zane draws, assesses the board, and passes the turn. Noah draws and plays an island. He casts his other commander, Sakashima of 1,000 Faces. Norin triggers and exiles. It enters as a copy of Krark the Thumbless. Noah moves to combat and attacks Zane with Krark. Zane takes it and Noah ends his turn. Rust draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a mountain onto the battlefield. He casts Impact Tremors. Norin triggers and exiles. The table grumbles and Impact Tremors resolves. Rust casts a Grindstone. He passes, Norin enters, and each opponent takes 1 from Impact Tremors. The turn moves to Mike. Mike draws and casts a Serra Ascendant. Norin triggers and exiles. Mike moves to his end step and Norin triggers. In response, Zane casts Assassin's Trophy, targeting Sakashima. Noah responds by casting Muddle the Mixture, targeting Assassin's Trophy. Both Krark and Sakashima trigger. Noah loses his first flip, returning Muddle back to his hand. He then wins his second flip, creating a copy of Muddle the Mixture, targeting Assassin's Trophy. Assassin's Trophy is countered, Norin enters, deals 1 to each opponent, and the turn moves to Zane. Zane draws and starts off his turn by casting Dockside Extortionist. Norin triggers and exiles. Dockside enters and Zane creates 6 treasures. He casts his commander, Yidris, Maelstrom Wielder. He follows it up with a Hermit Druid. With the table on high alert, he passes, Norin enters, and deals 1 to each opponent. Noah draws and casts Solve the Equation. Norin triggers and exiles. Krark and Sakashima both trigger. He wins the first flip, creating a copy of Solve the Equation. Noah fetches up a Jessica's Will into his hand. He then loses the second flip and returns Solve the Equation to his hand. Noah then casts Jessica's Will, targeting Mike. Krark and Sakashima trigger, and in response, Mike activates Monk Catcher. He fetches up a Dockside Extortionist onto the battlefield. Dockside triggers and creates 7 treasures. With the triggers still on the stack, Mike casts a Braid, targeting Sakashima, killing it. Then Krark and Sakashima's trigger resolve, Noah loses the first flip, bouncing Jessica's Will back to his hand, and then he loses the second flip as well. Dismayed, Noah ends the turn, Norin enters, and then deals 1 to each opponent. Rust draws and plays a Great Furnace. He moves to combat and attacks Zane with Norin. Norin triggers and exiles. Rust then moves to his end step and Norin triggers. In response, Mike casts Swords to Plowshares, targeting Hermit Druid. Hermit Druid is exiled and Zane gains 1 life. Then Norin enters and deals 1 damage to each opponent. Mike draws and starts off his turn by casting Kiki Jiki, Mirror Breaker. Norin triggers and exiles. The table then braces for impact as Kiki Jiki resolves. Mike activates Kiki Jiki, targeting his Dockside Extortionist. He creates a token of Dockside with haste and creates 6 treasures. Mike then casts Zealous Conscripts. It enters and targets Kiki Jiki, untapping it. Mike then presents a loop of activating Kiki Jiki to create a token copy of Zealous Conscripts. The token enters and untaps Kiki Jiki. He creates 69,420 copies of Zealous Conscripts for each of his opponents and then attacks for the win. Well, that was quick, so how about another? In this game, Noah brings back Krark and Sakashima. His opening hand contains a Misty Rainforest, Fiery Islet, Steam Vents, Cyclonic Rift, Lightning Bolt, and his London Mulligans are a Mana Confluence and an Underworld Breach. Rust brings back Norin, and his opening hand contains a Prismatic Vista, Strip Mine, Great Furnace, Skull Clamp, Hugh finds some prisoners, a Braid, and a Deflecting Swat. Mike brings back Winota, and his opening hand contains an Ancient Tomb, Cavern of Souls, Gingerbrute, Goblin Rabblemaster, Phyrexian Walker, and his London Mulligans are a Swords to Plowshares and a Cavalry Pegasus. Zane brings back Yidris, and his opening hand contains a Demonic Tutor, Brain Freeze, Culling Ritual, Talisman of Curiosity, Mana Crypt, Lotus Petal, and an Overgrown Tomb. And Noah gets to start us off. Noah draws a card for turn and plays a Misty Rainforest. He passes. Rust draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a mountain onto the battlefield. He casts a Skull Clamp. He ends his turn. Mike draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps his Ancient Tomb to cast Gingerbrute. Mike moves to combat and attacks Zane with Gingerbrute. Zane takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Mike casts Phyrexian Walker. He gives the turn to Zane. Zane draws and starts off his turn by casting Lotus Petal. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts Talisman of Curiosity. He plays an Overgrown Tomb into play untapped, paying 2 life. With a blazing fast start, he ends his turn. Noah draws and plays a Training Center. He passes. Rust draws and plays a Prismatic Vista. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a mountain onto the battlefield. He ends his turn. Mike draws and plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Goblin as it enters. He taps his Ancient Tomb to cast Goblin Rabblemaster. He moves to combat, Rabblemaster triggers, and creates a 1/1 Goblin with haste. He attacks Noah with his Goblin token and Gingerbrute. Noah takes it, and Mike ships his turn. During his upkeep, Zane loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a City of Brass. He taps his City of Brass and cracks his petal to cast Necropotence. It resolves, and Zane pays 15 life, exiling 15 cards. Zane moves to his end step, and Necropotence triggers. In response, Noah cracks his Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. Zane then puts the exiled cards into his hand and discards to hand size, exiling the discarded cards. Noah draws and plays a Fiery Islet. He casts his commander, Krark the Thumbless. He ends the turn. Rust draws and plays a Great Furnace. He passes. Mike draws and moves to combat. Goblin Rabblemaster triggers and creates a 1/1 Goblin token with haste. He attacks Zane with everything. Goblin Rabblemaster triggers, getting +2/+0 until end of turn. Zane takes it, and in his second main phase, Mike plays an Ink Moth Nexus. He gives the turn to Zane. During his upkeep, Zane wins his Mana Crypt trigger. He skips his draw step due to Necropotence. He plays a Command Tower. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond. He follows it up with an Underworld Breach. In response, Noah casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost. Krark triggers, and Noah wins the flip, creating a copy of Fierce Guardianship targeting Underworld Breach as well. In response, Zane casts Manamorphose, adding a blue and a black mana to his pool and drawing a card. Zane then casts Tainted Pact. It resolves and he exiles cards until he finds an Autumn's Veil, putting it into his hand. Zane taps his Talisman to cast Autumn's Veil. It resolves and both copies of Fierce Guardianship fizzle. Then Underworld Breach resolves. Zane escapes Lotus Petal from his graveyard. In response, Russ casts Chaos Warp targeting Underworld Breach. Chaos Warp resolves, Zane shuffles Underworld Breach into his library, and then he reveals a Dockside Extortionist off of the top of his library, putting it onto the battlefield. Everyone erupts, and Dockside creates 4 treasures. Zane then casts a Demonic Tutor. He fetches up a card into his hand. He casts Underworld Breach. He taps his City of Brass to cast Brain Freeze, with all copies targeting himself. Zane mills 33 cards. He activates Necropotence 4 times, paying 4 life and exiling the last 4 cards of his library. He sacrifices Lion's Eye Diamond, discarding his hand, exiling the cards through Necropotence, and adds 3 blue. He then escapes Thassa's Oracle from his graveyard. It enters, triggers, and Zane wins the game. Well, that was a pretty wild game, so let's play another. Russ brings back Norin, and his opening hand contains an Abrade, Cathartic Pyre, Tome of Legends, Jessica's Will, Grindstone, Soul Ring, and a Mountain. Mike brings back Winota, and his opening hand contains a Spectator Seeding, Mox Diamond, Jeweled Lotus, Loyal Apprentice, City of Traders, Gemstone Caverns, and an Alseid of Life's Bounty. Zane brings back Yidris, and his opening hand contains a Demonic Tutor, Dockside Extortionist, Watery Grave, Mana Crypt, Vampiric Tutor, and his London Mulligans are an Abrupt Decay and a Manamorphose. Noah brings back Krark and Sakashima, and his opening hand contains a Geistwave, Baral Chief of Compliance, Mystical Tutor, Shivan Reef, Misty Rainforest, and his London Mulligans are a Pyroblast and an Unsubstantiate. And Rust gets to start us off. But Mike has a pre-game action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Alseid of Life's Bounty. Rust draws a card for turn and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a mountain onto the battlefield. He casts a Soul Ring. He follows up with a Tomb of Legends. It enters with a page counter, and Rust ships the turn. Mike draws and plays a Prismatic Vista. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plains onto the battlefield. He casts Jeweled Lotus. He cracks his Lotus to help cast his commander, Winota, Joiner of Forces. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding Spectator Seeding. Mike casts a Loyal Apprentice. The table groans, and it resolves. Mike moves to combat, and Apprentice triggers, creating a 1/1 flying Thopter with haste. He attacks Zane with the Apprentice and the Thopter. Winota triggers, and Mike looks at the top 6 and fails to find. Zane takes it, and Mike, with an incredible turn 1 in the books, passes the turn. Zane draws and casts a Mana Crypt. He plays a Watery Grave into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Demonic Tutor. He fetches up a card into his hand and passes the turn. Noah draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He passes. Russ draws and plays a Mountain. He casts Jessica's Will, targeting Noah, adding 5 red. He then casts Blasphemous Act. Mike cries, and Blasphemous Act resolves, wiping the table of all creatures. Russ then gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a City of Traders. He casts Drannith Magistrate. He passes. At the end of Mike's turn, Noah cracks his Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up a Steam Vents onto the battlefield tapped. The turn then moves to Zane. During his upkeep, Zane wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He passes. Noah draws and plays a Shivan Reef. He casts Baral, Chief of Compliance. He ends the turn. Russ draws and casts a Mind Stone. He ends his turn. At the end of Rust's turn, Zane casts Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Mike draws and moves straight to combat. He attacks Zane with Drannith. Zane takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Mike casts Mogcatcher. He ships the turn to Zane. During his upkeep, Zane loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and cracks his Polluted Delta, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. He casts Culling Ritual. In response, Russ activates his Mind Stone, sacrificing it and drawing a card. Russ then activates Tomb of Legends, removing a page counter and drawing a card. Culling Ritual then resolves, wiping the board, and Zane adds 6 black. He casts Ad Nauseam. It resolves, and Zane reveals a Lightning Greaves, Imperial Seal, Bloodstained Mire, Lotus Petal, Chain of Vapor, Mana Vault, Flusterstorm, Wishclaw Talisman, Gemstone Caverns, Fate Stitcher, Underworld Breach, Mnemonic Betrayal, and a Lion's Eye Diamond, deciding to stop there. Zane casts Lion's Eye Diamond. He casts Lotus Petal. He plays a Bloodstained Mire. He casts Chrome Mox. It enters, and he imprints Dockside Extortionist. Zane cracks his Lotus Petal to cast Underworld Breach. He cracks his LED, discarding his hand and adding 3 black. He escapes LED from his graveyard. He cracks LED, adding 3 blue. He escapes Demonic Tutor. He fetches up a card into his hand. Zane then casts Brain Freeze with all copies targeting himself, milling 27 cards. Zane escapes LED once again. He cracks it for 3 blue. He casts Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and with the trigger on the stack, he escapes Demonic Consultation. Consultation resolves, he names Norin the Wary, and exiles his deck. Thassa's Oracle's trigger resolves, and Zane wins the game. Ladies and gentlemen, what an amazing set of games. Congrats to Zane and Mike on their wins tonight. In Game 1, everyone was busy trying to deal with Hermit Druid and Noah's commanders, allowing Mike to swoop in after the dust had settled and won the game. In Games 2 and 3, Zane was able to leverage his fast starts with the massive amount of cards that both Necropotence and Ad Nauseam offer. This just goes to show you how powerful using your life total as a resource really is. Shout out to both Zane and Russ for showing off their awesome and powerful decks. It's really cool to see some new and old commanders brought to the table tonight. The most valuable card in Game 1 goes to Mob Catcher. This is a 1-card win con that is able to tutor out both combo cards and value pieces in Mike's deck. It allowed him to do both and win. The most valuable card in Game 2 goes to Necropotence. Since this card was released back in Ice Age, it has been a dominant card advantage engine for many decks. Finally, the most valuable card in Game 3 goes to Culling Ritual. This is an amazing board wipe in CEDH since most permanents cost 2 mana or less. It also generates absurd amounts of mana when it clears that board. It crippled Zane's opponent's board states while simultaneously giving him the mana he needed to win the game. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. Tune in next time when we duke it out to see who will be king of the competitive EDH table. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.